I will get us started. My name is Elsa Hunason Jones, and I am a Caucasian woman with brown hair wearing a kippah. I'm wearing glasses. I have one cataract, and I have very sparkly hearing aids in my ears. And I wanted to let you know first, I'm the president of Seattle Council PTSA this year, and we're hosting Money Talks to support the community in having more information about the financial status of Seattle Public Schools, where all of our children go. This evening, we do not have any interpreters because we were not asked to have any this time around, but we are always happy to provide interpretation upon request. And so if in the future you need interpretation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. This evening, we are going to be speaking with Assistant Superintendent of Finance, Kurt Buttleman. Assistant Superintendent Buttleman came to SPS this past spring. With more than 25 years of educational leadership experience, Dr. Kurt Buttleman has a breadth and depth of experience ranging from leading large public educational institutions through challenging budget balancing to making sweeping changes and enhancements to business operating systems. He has a background in strategic planning, business and financial operations, and worked in partnership with Seattle schools for many years prior to joining SPS as an assistant superintendent of finance. He has earned a Bachelor of Science in Finance degree from the University of Illinois, a Master of Business Administration degree from the University of Washington, and a Doctor of Education Administration degree from North Carolina State University. Dr. Buttleman, if you could give a quick hello and visual description, that would kick us off.
Thanks, Elsa. Kurt Buttleman, Assistant Superintendent for Finance here at Seattle Public Schools. I've been in the role since June of 2020. I'm a Caucasian male. I'm standing wearing a dark jacket over a light blue shirt and a lanyard with multicolored flags on it. I want to thank the PTSA for having this event and for the invitation. As Elsa said, a little background on me. I worked for more than 20 years in the community college system here in Seattle. And in the last few years of that, worked extensively or a lot with the Seattle Public Schools on the Seattle Promise Program implementation with leadership of the school district and school leaders. So this opportunity to work at Seattle Public Schools and make a difference for our kids is really appealing to me in this new role. And I think it's a privilege to work with Dr. Jones and our school board. A couple personal things. You may see me drink from my Whittier Elementary cup from time to time throughout the evening. I was a former PTA treasurer there, and both of my kids are graduates of the public school system and are on to college at this point. So thanks again for having me. I look forward to the questions and providing some information.
So we've been reaching out to community in a whole bunch of different ways, and we want to acknowledge that we've received more questions than we will have time to talk about tonight, because everybody has questions about money. Fortunately, tonight's Money Talks is the first of many that we'll be having this academic year, and we look forward to the ongoing discussion with you. Tonight, we're going to have two areas of focus, both centered around where, when, and how community can share thoughts, ideas, feedback, and engage around funding for our district. We'll be talking about decisions that are made at the district level, as well as decisions made at the state level. But through it all, our focus will be on centering the needs of our students. We'll start off at the district level. Assistant Superintendent Buttleman, can you start us off with a bit of an overview of the system of well-resourced schools conversation? Why the emphasis on the system of well-resourced schools?
Thank you. Before I sort of start answering the questions, I want to make sure folks are aware that there's a lot of information on our website, and we're going to continue to update information not only on the well-resourced schools initiative, but on the budget, some of the financial information, trying to make this information more accessible in different ways. So in answer to your question, I don't know if folks who are viewing this know that last spring and through the summer, Superintendent Brent Jones launched a community-wide effort to get input to reimagine what the Seattle Public Schools might look like as a system of well-resourced schools. with an emphasis on safety, equity, and offering students and families programs, services, and resources they need to succeed and thrive in the neighborhoods where they live. And so there was a series, I believe there was 5 in-person engagements and at least a couple of online opportunities for feedback. I think more than 4,000 people participated in that in one way or another, with 10,000 pieces of data coming forward. The district has been compiling the themes of that. Some of those themes are around neighborhood locations, safety, playgrounds being adequate, having dedicated skilled educators in all the buildings, arts and music programs, stability of staff, and of choices for families. And so this is going to help guide all this information, the future strategic planning, the system of the Seattle Public Schools around all the resource allocation decisions, funding for this well-resourced schools initiative, the future levy planning, our engagement with the city on the family educational preschool and promise levy, and our capital campaign levies. So the system will, and the idea here is to provide a more stable, diverse, and rich learning environment across this system for the kids that and families that are working in Seattle Public Schools.
So we had all of those meetings in the summer and early fall. Where are we going next? What can we expect moving forward in terms of continuing engagement for families?
Thank you. That was what we're calling phase 1 of the engagement opportunity, and probably shortly after the holidays there'll be announcements about what phase 2 will look like. The board at its meeting next week is considering a resolution that relates directly to how the district might proceed in terms of well-resourced schools in the future. And so January, February is when I would look for more information on how those new engagement opportunities will present themselves. And we'll continue to use that information. It's been invaluable thus far, and trying to help inform how to have the district move forward through this current situation.
That makes sense. We're definitely coming up on the end of the quarter, and with heading into winter break, it sounds like families need to pay attention to February in terms of well-resourced schools. But are there any other critical times for families to be paying attention and be ready to engage with the district?
Yes. One of the things the district is trying to do a little bit more proactively than might have been the case for lots of different reasons is being more clear about what the longer term vision for some of these engagements, how the longer term vision for Seattle Public Schools might play out. And so back in August or September, we started the budget work sessions with the board, which was early based on past history, to try and set up sort of a full annual schedule of how we would approach this. We're 4 meetings, counting next week's meeting, into an 11 meeting process, with the last meeting being an assessment of how that worked and how the community responded to that, and whether we need to make changes going forward. So initially, the most important dates I would highlight are next Wednesday, December 13th, when the board votes on this resolution. There was about a 2 or 3 hour discussion about it at the November 15th meeting, but they'll be formally voting on that. So something that will be informative going forward. Around that time, the governor will be proposing his version of the supplemental operating budget for 24. That'll be informative in different ways for how the school district might respond to that. So about that same week, we expect to see that. And then through January, February, March, April, May, there will be opportunities for the board and the community to engage in the budget conversation, not only for the 24-5 financial budget, but for the going forward budget, trying to take that longer term view. And then another key date is currently in that resolution the board has not yet voted on. The superintendent is recommending coming back by May 8th of 2024 with his plan to realize this vision for a system of well-resourced schools. So those, I think, are the key dates. Next Wednesday, December 13th, will be informative. and then throughout that, and then May 8th is a key date as well.
That all makes a lot of sense, and we will definitely be writing those dates down and reminding people when they can be paying attention. Budgets are moral documents, and we've heard from our school board that they want to see us move from a compliance-based budget to a budget that is not only in compliance, but that is aligned with the strategic plan, with the vision and values of community as expressed through the goals and guardrails. The percentage of Black boys who achieve English language arts proficiency or higher on the third grade Smarter Balanced Assessment will increase from 28% in June 2019 to 70% in June 2024. The percentage of Black boys and teens in seventh grade who achieve proficiency or higher on the seventh grade Smarter Balanced Assessment in math will increase from 23% in June of 2019 to 45% in June 2024 and 70% in June 2026, essentially doubling over 3 years, 3 years and reaching the targeted 70% in 5 years. The percentage of Black boys and teens who graduate having successfully completed at least one advanced course will increase from 54% in June of 2019 to 62% in June 2024. How do you interpret shifting from a compliance-based budget to a budget that actively works to support our district's strategic plan and to make sure that our funding is in alignment with our goals, such as the ones I just listed above?
Thank you for listing those. I think that's great context. Part of the answer to this for me is this longer term look. Many of the goals and guardrails that you've described are not just what we're going to do in 24/5, but over time, how are we going to make a change in these measures for our Black boys and teens who are in the Seattle Public Schools. And part of the way the board is leading that is there's this transition going on, and I don't know if people are conversant in the student outcomes focused governance model that the board is undertaking, but the idea there is that the district is trying to be responsible for ensuring that the district is achieving the community's vision for Seattle students while adhering to the community's values of safe, anti-racist, high-quality learning environments. And so in short, they're setting goals for student outcomes based on the community's vision and based on the community's values for how that vision will be achieved. And so this well-resourced schools engagement is a good feed into that conversation. And the board is really focused on this student outcomes focused governance. And a part of my task as CFO is to be able to have the budget reflect how the budget and decisions made around that will manifest better achievement of some of these outcomes. And so trying to figure out and work actively to be more intentional about how budget decisions are demonstrated through those goals and guardrails that you described.
Currently, our district pushes funding out to our buildings through the weighted staffing standard, WSS, and there has broadly been concern that the WSS as it stands now may be a barrier to truly supporting getting the outcomes that we're discussing that we want. Who is participating in the discussion around changes to the WSS? Where does that conversation take place, and how can community participate?
The WSS, I think, has been around about this time that I was the PTA treasurer at Whittier. So I have a long history of trying to understand that and the nuances of that personally. I think it's been around since 2008 or 2009. And it's in large part driven by a policy of the board, policy 6010, which is the school funding model policy. So it's focused on how the district decides around funding for the schools of the Seattle Public Schools. Some of the elements of that in the board policy are ensuring that however resources are distributed, that they provide the core staffing needed for schools so they can focus on academic issues, that they're aligning staff adjustments with changing student populations, that they're basing data on personnel differently to schools based on the student population, including poverty, bilingual, special education, highly capable, academic performance. And so the participants of that are traditionally the principals. There's some teacher union representation, staff, and part of not part of a large part of the way the community can participate is that it, just like in the well-resourced schools conversation, information gleaned from those types of engagements is invaluable to hear what the community wants in their local schools. And so a great way to participate is continue to participate in those conversations, because they really do help inform the decisions that need to be made around those resource allocations.
Okay. So now I'm going to give you that question that nobody likes to be asked, which is, where does our district funding come from?
So there's a lot of different places. I'll try to boil it down to a few. The majority, so the district for the 23-24 year is anticipating about $1.2 billion in resources. Of that 1.2 billion, approximately 700 million comes from the state. And another 190 million of that comes from the local levy that Seattle voters so generously provide. So the two main parts of that, almost, I guess it's nearly 900 million of the 1.2 billion come from the state and the local levy. There's some federal grants. COVID, there was a big bump in that because the district and all school districts got some special money for COVID impact. That's going away effective the end of this year. So the federal money will start to dwindle. There's lots of federal grants that will persist, and title funds and things like that. And those are the main balances. There are other resources. There's some the local levy, the PEP levy that the city of Seattle provides is one of those. But primarily it's the state and local levy taxes that fund the school district.
Okay. My next question is, what is a structural deficit as it relates to our district?
That is also a very complex question. So I'll try to
I bet it is.
try to be as succinct as possible. The short answer to that is expenses are projected to exceed the revenue for the foreseeable future. And so there's not an anticipation of a huge reduction of expenses without some significant changes, nor is there anticipation of a huge increase in revenue. And so as time goes on, those continue to be out of balance. And then something has to give. There needs to be either more revenue or less expenses in some way. So it's particularly acute for the Seattle Public Schools right now because those one-time resources I described a little bit earlier from the federal government are going away. And the school district was fortunate to have those to sort of soften some of the impact of the structural challenge that has been building over time. At the board meetings, we've been talking about Legos as a way of as a way of showing what this means. The state superintendent, Chris Reichel, has Legos in his office that represent different types of funding streams that he uses.
You need me to go and get Legos because I have them in the other room.
You'd have to build a little tower that might we're running out of red Legos. Red Legos represent the one-time resources that the district has. And so as we've been using up those red Legos to sort of support the whole, that's part of the problem, is there are less red Legos. This last budget was balanced in part by utilizing the rainy day fund. So the district chose to utilize the funding that has been saved up for sort of the emergency fund. And that was kind of the last big bucket of red Legos that were available. And so it's time now to do something about either increasing that revenue significantly or decreasing those expenses in a significant way so that going forward, the system has more stability and we can do more sort of longer term planning around how the finances inform the goals and things like that you described.
Okay, but the structural deficit are our budget challenges solely the result of enrollment decline and the lack of COVID funds, the sort of the COVID funds going away?
No, I don't think so. I think that's part of it, the enrollment decline. Seattle Public Schools has lost nearly 5,000 students since 2019, which equates to around $80 million. But those students also come with needs and resource needs. And so you can't just say, if you have 5,000 more students, you're almost there to fill that $100 million deficit we've heard about. Because you need more teachers, you need more buses, you need more custodians, you need more everything to support a larger number of students. So enrollment is a factor. One of the larger factors is just deficiencies in state funding. Seattle Public Schools has a large population of special education kids that we serve very well. And the state does not fully fund the expenses for that. Another example that sort of comes to mind is the amount of money the state provides for substitute teachers or substitute employees. The funding formula for that hasn't changed in nearly 30 years. And so obviously salaries have gone up, people have accrued more sick time, or we've offered more sick time. And so there's some real sort of elemental things within the budget that are underfunded by the state. Transportation is another one that comes to mind. So that's a big factor. Enrollment is a factor. And then just this reliance on one-time funding that we talked a little bit about. Some of the uncertainty coming out of the pandemic. So the district was not unusual in other large organizations and not knowing really what was going to happen once, if and when the pandemic subsided in impact. And so there were some inefficiencies that probably have developed that are trying to, now that we have a little more certainty about what the future looks post that phase of the pandemic, can start to recapture some efficiencies in the system. And then there's been staffing growth. Student needs have changed dramatically since the pandemic. And so having the staff support to support those kids has resulted in staffing growth. And so those are some of the factors in addition to that decline in enrollment.
I have to admit, I'm very curious about sort of the relationship between the pandemic and that enrollment decline. And I don't know that you have an answer for that, but this is my off the cuff. I'm just curious what that relationship is.
I'm hesitant to sort of offer a precise answer to that, but there's clearly a connection to that. And our demographers and enrollment experts don't predict like enrollment is going to bounce back dramatically anytime soon, but rather will continue to decline, at least for the foreseeable future. And so I think there was a headline today that across the state enrollment was up a little bit in the fall. And so still processing and digesting what that means for our system. Yeah.
That makes sense. Before we go further, I want to state really clearly that while you are by law not allowed to guide advocacy, you, Dr. Buttleman, are allowed to inform. So to put it differently, you can't tell us to advocate for something, but we can ask you questions and then decide whether or how to advocate based on that information. I think the corgi is advocating for walkies, which I cannot give her at this time. So to put it differently, you can't tell us how to advocate for something, but we can ask you questions and then decide whether or how to advocate based on the information you give us. The bulk of our district's funding comes from our state, and our state does not amply or even adequately fund our districts. As we look across the state, we see that school districts do not have the funding they need. Districts, including our own, are struggling to balance their budgets. 3 districts, Marysville, LaConner, and Mount Baker, have entered under binding conditions with the state. Can you tell us what people are talking about when they say binding conditions?
Yes, and thank you for the discussion about advocacy. I can advocate for people to cheer for the Huskies in the national championship playoffs, though, right?
I'm not allowed to. I'm married to a Michigan fan.
That's unfortunate. But, anyway, the binding conditions is a very complex and somewhat rare thing that has happened across the state for school districts. There's a presentation on the OSP website that my predecessor in this job, Jolyn Berge, and her colleague and our colleague from OSPI, TJ Kelly, put together. That's kind of an extensive um, explanation for what that really means. So I'm stealing a little bit from what they've presented in trying to be concise about this. So in short, there's rules that the school districts, all 295 school districts, have to submit a budget to the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI, each year. And that budget has to balance. So that means expenditures cannot exceed expected revenues from all sources. And if it is not balanced, they can request to borrow against future state revenue. So that's the binding conditions part. And so the idea is they're borrowing against future payments that they were going to get. And the district is charged with coming up with a plan for no longer needing that future revenue and borrowing from those future payments that they would have received. The local educational service district in this region is Puget Sound Educational Service District, assigns a person, a fiscal officer, to kind of assist that district and provide some expertise and not sort of just not being a decider on things, but just helping them sort of find their way through this, what is intended to be a short-term challenge. And so there have been a handful, not more than 20, I don't think, in the state that have ever entered into those binding conditions. There are 2 or 3 or 4 right now in the Puget Sound region that have. And so something is a little different right now in the way school districts are financed. But in short, it's kind of a way of borrowing future money from the state so that districts can balance their budget.
Okay. So what we've all heard is that our district is 105 million short. Is that accurate? And based on what you just shared with us, is our district likely to go under binding conditions?
So the projection is that $105 million for the 24-5 fiscal year budget. It's subject to small fluctuations. Utilities could go up between now and then and some other things, but that's generally what we've projected. The district is doing all that it can to balance the budgets. And again, back to that binding conditions definition, one of the ways you go into binding conditions is we can't produce a balanced budget. So the district is planning to produce a balanced budget. This resolution on December 13th, next week, is sort of the plan for how the district is planning to do that. And the main elements of that are potentially borrowing from our capital fund. And so the district has been lucky to have a generous capital fund to build buildings, but the cash comes in different ways than it needs to be spent. So at the end of the day, all the cash will be spent and the buildings will be built, but along the way, there's some excess cash as it builds up to build those new buildings. And so one of the things that might happen, not saying that it will or will not at this point, is there'd be authority potentially to do some borrowing from that. And the idea there is to build some more time to have a really engaging and thoughtful approach to this well-resourced schools conversation. Other things that the district is considering that are embedded in the superintendent's recommendation are further reductions at the central office in staffing and expenses, reductions potentially at the schools in staffing and expenses, additional changes to transportation, potentially some fees, sales of some non-school properties as one-time measures, program adjustments, delaying the repayment schedule on that rainy day reserve that I talked about earlier, and then being more precise with some of our activities, which could allow us to reduce some of the contingency funds that we have to sort of ameliorate some impacts. And then there's some other one-time funds that have accumulated over the history of the district that could potentially be used to balance that budget. So I believe your question was are we likely to go into binding conditions? The district feels like we're going to have a way to balance the budget for 24-5 and 25-6.
Okay, so not likely, but it's, I guess, maybe a distant possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. Last legislative session, our district asked the state for permission for us to borrow for ourselves. Is that the fund you were just talking about?
Yeah, there was legislation that allows the district to, in order to balance its budget, borrow from its capital fund. It wasn't specific to Seattle. This was for any district in the state.
A lot of people find that concept confusing. So is it something that SPS is likely to do again? And if so, can you explain what that would mean?
So it's one of the tools that the superintendent is recommending the board arm him with in his toolkit in his budget balancing exercise for the coming year. I've been struggling with trying to figure out a better way to sort of make this digestible for people. And my kids are now in college, so I'm going to use a college fund example. So I've been accumulating funds for years to help my kids go to college. My furnace went out. And so borrowing money from my kids' college fund to repair the broken furnace while also needing to repay my kids' college fund over time is kind of the equivalent of borrowing from the capital fund to get us through this next couple of years of budget challenges and then repaying the capital fund again once that's done. And so building into my ongoing budget, the payback of that loan to my college fund is a way that I've thought might be more relatable for people because it is confusing. I agree with that.
And is this different from borrowing from future funds?
I think future funds is probably just a different way of saying binding conditions, so borrowing from future state appropriations or apportionment.
Okay. So when our families go to legislators and ask for increased funding for our district, they're often told that our district should make better use of the money we have and that there should be more accountability and that we have the funding we need. Given our families would like to know the answers to a few questions. And let's start with how often and when does the district get audited by whom? That's a second part. By whom? And if community members wanted to learn more about the audits, where would they look for them?
Good question. Seattle Public Schools is audited annually by the state auditor's office. Just this last week, they notified us that they'll be starting their engagement here soon, and typically it lasts 4 or 5 months where they're here auditing the district. On our website, under the finance section, there's a new section that has the audited financial reports, and I believe there are 3 that are displayed there. There's also information. The state has a couple of reports that have really a lot of detail around the budget and the actual expenditures that happen. They have names. One of them's F-195. That's the budget document. The other one's F-196, and that's kind of the comprehensive spending document. Those are also held there. And so if the community or interested parties want to look at that information, we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. Part of what we're trying to do is inform the community as best that we can on some of the challenges and opportunities so that when they participate, they're coming with full knowledge and information so they can participate in a very meaningful way. Another sort of oversight thing I want to mention is the board and their student outcomes focused government. I lost the outcomes there. Has formed an audit committee, and so those meetings are public. They're taped, they're videoed, and it meets approximately quarterly. And the results of those meetings are also on the school board website under the school board page. And so if you really want to get into how the district is audited and what the different opportunities to find out more about these audits and this oversight, that's a great resource as well. It's a very active committee.
That's fantastic to hear. Under our state's funding model, what is the size of the prototypical elementary school, middle school, and high? Oh, I skipped over a question. It's important. Can you tell us what people are talking about when they talk about the state's prototypical formula? What is it?
Yes. I think there could be a class or a day-long workshop on the prototypical model. There probably are day-long workshops. But in short, it's the way that the state decides to how they make decisions around providing money to the 295 school districts in the state. It's in an RCW. It's 28A.150.220 with all the details on what that looks like. And within there, it's talks about the school size that the funding model approximates funding. Talks about some class size issues. It talks about some details in different parts of the districts and schools. And so this is kind of a one size fits model, one size fits all model for the largest Seattle to the smallest school districts in the state. And so there's concession, there's other things that add into that model to ameliorate some of those differences, but in short, it's the way the state and the legislature do their share of the funding for the school districts in the state of Washington.
Okay, so under that funding model, what is the size of the prototypical elementary school, middle school, and high school?
So in the model, so there's another little nuance to it. In the prototypical model, an elementary school is defined as kindergarten through 6. So there are some districts that are kindergarten through 6. Seattle is not. It's kindergarten through 5. And then there are some K-8s. And so the prototypical model determines an elementary school size. They're funding at 400 average students in elementary school. So 400 students. Middle school, they're talking about 432 students. And then a high school, 600 students. And again, they're defining middle schools grade 7 and 8. So
Okay.
432 and 600.
Okay. So how many schools do we have that are smaller than the prototypical?
So we take that elementary school 400 as our base, even though we have one grade less typically. There are 50 of the 63 elementary schools in Seattle that are below that 400. And 27 or 28, if you count one of the K-8s, are below 300. So we have a larger number, a much larger number of elementary schools under that 300 number than any of the districts sort of surrounding Seattle. None of the districts contiguous to Seattle have any under 300. So about 50 of ours are under 400. In terms of middle schools, there's one middle school below the 432. And then of the 17 high schools, there are 6 of the 17. Obviously not Ballard, Roosevelt, the more comprehensive high schools, but 6 of the other 17, 6 is the 17 total high schools are under the 600 number.
In Washington, we have a part-time legislature that runs in a 2-year cycle. We often talk about it in terms of a long session and a short session, or the budget year and the not a budget year. The session that starts in January, this January, is a short 60-day session, and this is not a budget year. Typically in short sessions, we see an emphasis on policy with a risk of unfunded mandates and more targeted and smaller financial requests because there are fewer dollars in play. Before we say anything else, can you give us a short definition of an unfunded mandate and maybe an example of an unfunded mandate from the past?
So an unfunded mandate definition is a regulation or statute that requires an entity to perform an action or to do something without providing money for fulfilling that requirement. And so a couple of examples that come to mind, not just related to the school district, but the Seattle minimum wage is a good example for public institutions in Seattle. When there's a new minimum wage requirement, the school district, the community colleges, University of Washington, other public entities, the city of Seattle, didn't get funding directly to help fund that increased cost. Other examples, full-time medical for part-time staff. And so someone's making a determination on who's eligible for medical benefits, but they're not providing the funding if part-time staff or more, if more part-time staff are eligible. One of the other things that often comes up at school districts, especially Seattle, is special education services. So we have a legal obligation to serve all students with disabilities in Washington, regardless of the cost. And so there's a limit to what Seattle Public Schools gets in terms of funding from the state for those costs. And so anything up and above that could be considered an unfunded mandate.
Okay, so this session, we expect there to be a lot of discussion around the capital gains tax. Can you talk about how that money is designated to be spent and what this might look like for our district?
This is the $900 million question. So this is $500 million was sort of anticipated to be generated through this capital gains tax. It appears, from what I understand, it's significantly more than that. The superintendent of public instruction has come out pretty aggressively, wanting most of that money to do with capital for funding buildings and facilities of school districts in K-12. I'm not currently aware of a lot of revenue advocacy on the operating budget side for that. There may be, just not aware of it yet. I think we'll know a lot more when the session begins in January. But we want to do all we can to make sure that the resources that are generated from that are benefiting the population that is intended by that resource. And so what it will look like for a district, I think, is anybody's guess at this point. I don't think it's probably the answer to the Seattle Public Schools budget structural deficit, but hopefully it can help the kids here and elsewhere in different ways as that moves forward.
We understand that State Superintendent Rakedahl will be asking for a $7 an hour raise for IAs and an increase in funding in the prototypical for IAs. What percentage of the IAs in our district are funded by the state? What about levies and federal dollars?
So I don't have access or ability at this point to kind of get that precise with the funding and the way Seattle manages its instructional assistant budgets. But I can provide some information that in the so this is a significant part of the Seattle Public Schools budget. It's about $125 million. And that's more than 1,500 instructional assistants that are planned for in the 23-24 budget. The average salary benefit cost for one of those positions is in the ballpark of $80,000. The large majority of those are not funded by the state. The biggest portion of ours that are funded by the state are funded by the state's special education safety net. But beyond that, most of that is funded with local dollars, other federal dollars. None of our bilingual instructional assistants are funded by the state. The model only funds certificated teachers in that regard. And so it's $125 million, the large majority of which is not directly funded by the state.
Okay. At WSPTA Legislative Assembly, State Superintendent Rakedahl told PTAs that he would be making an immense capital budget request this year. We also regularly hear from Senator Peterson that Seattle pays the state more in sales tax when we build or renovate a school than we receive from the state. How would OSPI's capital request, if funded as requested, which we acknowledge is unlikely, impact our district?
So Seattle's been very fortunate, again, in its capital levies, and is not proportionally a huge recipient of the state capital funding. So if Superintendent Rakedahl is successful with this capital budget request, it will help Seattle, but not sort of the ways that it would be intended to help some smaller districts that don't have as much levy funding as Seattle does. We've been getting around $10 to $15 million a year from the state capital funding. while spending around $250 million. And so it's a relatively small amount for Seattle, but of course it would be helpful to us in terms of if Superintendent Ragdoll's successful or not.
Okay. So our district is currently out of compliance with a court decision around accessible alarm systems, and we're aware that there are more families exploring filing another lawsuit on the same topic. I think we can agree that having alarms that are accessible to our students, staff, volunteers, families, and visitors is fundamental to creating a safe and welcoming environment. As a deafblind parent of hearing kids, I can, you know, pretty much speak to that. But will our district be prioritizing requesting funding from the state's capital budget this season for this purpose?
Thank you. Another thing I just want to make sure folks are aware is the school board's adopted 24 legislative priorities are also on the website. One of those priorities is related to what you're talking about, and that's providing stable and equitable operations by providing state capital funding for accessible, high quality learning environments. And so it is one of the board's legislative priorities. I know that there's discussion, active conversation right now around the specific issue you're raising, and it's something that is one of the priorities for the board is this high quality and sustainable capital investments to make sure our facilities are accessible and high quality learning environments. Some of the other priorities, not necessarily in priority order, are addressing funding gaps in basic education. We talked a little bit about that. Supporting student learning and supporting student well-being. And there's a lot of details beneath each of those. I pulled it up here and I'm kind of skimming to see if there's anything that we haven't talked about in some way that I want to mention there. One of the other priorities, culturally responsive curriculum and courses, school safety, mental health, social, emotional learning, harm reduction, restorative practices. And so again, a lot of that information is available, and yes, these are the legislative priorities.
Last session, we saw funding for transportation fail to get concurrence between the House and Senate on E2 SSB 5174. Our district is an outlier when it comes to the amount that we spend on transportation. Can you explain why we are an outlier, and can you tell us what impact E2 SSB 5174 would have had on our district if passed in its current version, and describe the differences in impact between the House version and the Senate version? I know that's a lot.
It's a lot, and it's before my time as well, so I'll give it my best shot. So part of the reason Seattle is somewhat of an outlier in transportation costs is the large number of locations that are dispersed throughout the city. The choices Seattle has made around bell times, there are 2 bell times instead of 3, as some other districts have, which leads to some increased costs, just sort of by definition. There's a lot of special education needs that are being served in Seattle, and more than half of the transportation costs relate to special education transportation in Seattle. There are also some unique programs that are situated in different places throughout the city. The Skills Center transportation is a cost that's unique to Seattle and not all districts across the state. Last year in the budget balancing exercise, there was some adjustments made to transportation. I think about 12 schools were impacted with changes to bell times to create a little more efficiency across the system. In terms of the House versus the Senate, I don't have enough information to describe the differences or to pick a favorite, but suffice it to say that if we're able to revise the funding, the student transportation formula in some way to fully cover the cost of actual student transportation, that would be a great benefit for the students and families in the Seattle Public Schools. And so supportive of some changes to how transportation is funded for sure.
By law, our district must provide services for highly capable students, and our state provides funding for this purpose. Is the amount provided adequate for that?
So we get about $1.7 million specifically for highly capable cohort services, student costs, and we spend the same. And so we're spending what we're getting. A lot of that is spent on advanced learning specialist staff. It's subjective of me to speculate whether it's adequate or not. I think that's what families and school leaders would have interpretations on that. But what we are doing is we're making sure those resources are going towards that program, that highly capable program. And it's about $1.7 million here in the Salem district.
Okay, we have so many more questions and could keep this going for a long time, but it's 7:55 on a Thursday, and so it's a good thing we're planning to do this again. In the meantime, I will reiterate that while Assistant Superintendent Buttleman cannot guide advocacy, PTAs can. So please make sure your PTA's legislative chairs are entered into Member Planet as either advocacy or legislative so that they can get included on our mailing lists. We've got specific training for our legislative chairs so that they can support their PTA communities. And also please keep an eye out on our SCPTSA newsletters for upcoming events, legislative updates, and information about how to testify, how to email your legislators, important bills, and more. Tonight, we focused on budget, but legislative advocacy goes beyond budgets, and we'll have info for that for you to come. Info about that coming soon. Thank you so much, Assistant Superintendent Buttleman, for joining us this evening and for answering our questions.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy that we've got some more of these on the schedule going forward. And thank you, June, for technical hosting. Everything seemed to work on my end. So
thank you so much, June, for skills that I do not have. And to everybody like me who's celebrating Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. Enjoy your first night, enjoy your latkes, and enjoy your donuts.
Yes, thank you. You need me for anything right now?
No, we are done. Thank you